Welcome. This is a scripture conversation for the 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time
with Alex.
And Sister Joanne.
In the gospel reading, Matthew chapter 13, verse 44 through 52, I notice how God accompanies us throughout the entire time, all along the way, even if we don't know it. So first thing, that Jesus guides his disciples past the crowds. There was that distinction between disciples and crowds, and he dismissed the crowds dispersed, but he tells them, his disciples, where they need to go, which is sending them on a boat in the water. And then I'm seeing then that Jesus says he prays. And in my head, I'm thinking, okay, I'm pretty sure he's praying for his disciples. So even though they're separated, physically separated from Jesus, Jesus is still guiding them. He's still praying for them. And then during the harsh waves, Jesus appears to calm their fears, not the waves. And so he's there again, even in the midst of this scary situation. And I want to make the distinction that stood out for me was the fact that Jesus never said, come to me in the water. Peter made the initiation, if it is you, let me come to you, walk on water as well. So Peter on his own wanted to make that journey on his own, and Jesus was there with him too. Peter, he loses focus. Jesus is there to pick him right up as he's sinking.
I'll reference again this Diocese of Cleveland priest, George Smiga, who said of this particular gospel passage, he thinks a message of it is, sometimes you have to get out of the boat. And that's just part of life. Jesus says, okay, I know there's peace there, but sometimes you've got to get out of the boat. And Peter understands more than anybody, probably, that sinking is part of the journey of life.
Father Mark Thibodeau from Louisiana, he highlighted for me how the other disciples only paid Jesus homage once the wind settled and Jesus came in the boat. So he kind of was balancing these two things about how the other disciples didn't get out of the boat, they didn't take that journey. And he, on the other hand, highlighted how courageous it was for Peter to do what he did. And I've heard other commentaries talk about this, the language of it was the fourth watch of the night. That meant that it was the darkest part of the night. And so for Peter to want to come to Jesus, knowing that he can't see, he can't, on his mind, step on anything. He has no grounding and he's being pushed by these external winds. And he still wants to make that journey to Jesus. In the same way, leave the boat, leave that comfort, the last thing they're probably all gripping on. Father Thibodeau. And I think he was extrapolating from that. And he says that's what Jesus is sometimes in the storm. And he's calling us out of that comfort, whatever we're clinging on. But naturally, there are issues that we don't want to face, walk into, deal with. But nonetheless, God calls us to make that journey.
Sometimes that's what we're needing to do, to step out of the boat, if we are in sync with the presence of God in life.
I wrote down in reading both First Kings and the Gospel of Matthew, whatever our great fear is, God is greater. Whatever we can imagine and try to limit God to be, God is greater. God exists beyond that. And that can be terrifying to know how limited our minds and thoughts can be and how grand God is. I think from the first reading, is God in the storm, in the earthquake, in the fire. Like these are kind of the things that we probably, at that point, were trying to limit God to be. In essence, it was like, no, God's in the quiet silence, or however that gets translated. And then even in the gospel reading, the disciples in the boat couldn't believe that God was in Jesus because they saw him, but they were like, it's probably a ghost, because they were trying to imagine something else. Their fears of dying, their fears of the darkness and the winds was causing them. In Peter's situation, he still thought his fears of falling in the water, sinking, was greater than God. Even if Jesus already said he is God and he's already walking on top of water and Peter's joining him, he's still holding his fears as greater than God, greater than Jesus. And that's why he kind of starts sinking.
We don't realize how transactional we are. So we think in terms of, do I have enough faith, enough amount of it, if that could just be stronger. So because the apostles, you used the word imagine, they couldn't imagine Peter ever walking on water, right? So because faith is inviting us beyond reason, that's the transformation rather than the transaction, I think. But yet we keep defaulting into measuring and thinking in terms of balancing equations mathematically, I think, or believing it's a matter of pure dint of will or something like that, when it actually isn't. Job said at one point in his story, even though he kill me, the divinity, God, yet will I trust him. I've always thought that little line really packed such a punch, because that's really it. Reductively, we really don't know anything about death much, except that God is on the other side of it in a way that we can't imagine. And actually, even part of it, as we identify ourselves with the Paschal mystery, God is in the surrender. God is in whatever is on the other side of death. And still, I will trust God. And then the second thing I think is how the apostles kept getting totally new insights into who Jesus was. Just before this story with the multiplication of loaves and fishes, they were constantly like, wow, I would imagine. And then the last sentence says, those who were in the boat did him homage. There's all this response because it's yet another revelation of incarnate divinity. They cannot ever get finished wrapping their brains around it. I worry sometimes that we get so used to hearing stories like this that we become rather passive to their message.
One thing that came to my mind was how Jesus walking on the water reminds me of how God hovered above the water in Genesis, the creation story. God hovered around it and started creating. And so in the gospel reading, as Jesus is walking over the water, it's the same idea too. In this chaotic water, Jesus is here. The other part I think I saw in many commentaries was the fact that the English translation does no justice to when Jesus tells his disciples, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. The it is I means I am, the same one tied to the Moses encounter with God in the burning bush. And even at the end, it says those who are in the boat him homage, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. So throughout this, it keeps kind of repeating, God, 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 always present there, that theme or the idea of God.
The message of the scriptures in their entirety is that, is it not? God, 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 love, 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 here, 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 this. How many times, how many different ways can you say love? And how many different ways can you show it? See, what I think comes from what you just said is the steadfastness of God in presence and love and goodness and life and light. And we mirror him in that steadfastness when we come to understand love as a way of continually responding.
In the first reading, First Kings, it wasn't that Elijah was just sitting somewhere in a peaceful prairie. It was after the experience of the fire, the earthquake, the wind that Elijah experienced and heard God. In that same light, God in Jesus was in the darkness, in the strong winds. It's more comfortable to stay inside the cave, stay in the boat and not venture off. But we have to make that journey.
I think it was mythically the chaotic waters symbolized something that was just opposite of the divine. And here is Jesus saying nothing is separated from the divine. So I think the fact that, and you referenced the waters of Genesis, the chaos out of which God created the world and life. And this is just another evocative image to people for whom the myth of the waters of chaos was very strong. And the power of that message that God could even be part of that must have been truly transformative to them. And to us, we can't ever presume that we can exclusively name all things that are of God. We just can't. Situations or feelings or whatever it is. We do not know the breadth and length and height and depth. So we just have to keep our eyes open, which is part of the discipline of prayer.
I mentioned I got the idea of the Genesis creation story with Jesus walking over the water. And one thought that came to my mind from that idea was, that type of power, that type of creation, we can't handle it. To our minds to be like, oh yeah, I'll probably would have been there in creation and seen it. And it was like, no, we can't even have been there. The grandness, we can't even walk or step through that without Jesus. Yeah, there's some things that we just leave it to God and follow God. We have to humble ourselves.
In the Elijah pericope, the wind, the earthquake, the fire, all of those had been theophanies of the divine in the experience of the Israelites, right? But that story collapses all that into the experience of God in the tiny whispering sound. What I think would be dangerous and wrong would be to say, therefore, God is in silence or God is in whispers. And this is piggybacking on what you're saying about we can't handle the truth, right, of God. I think the idea is not that in the tiny whispering sound is contained the truth of God, but rather it's still a mystery. You're not going to get it.
You just brought into my mind this idea of how that, I think, was it called tetragrammaton?
Tetragrammaton.
Tetragrammaton.
Tetragrammaton, yeah.
How in that sacred name of God, I heard someone say that really the way the Hebrew pronunciation of it is more of a breathing in, breathing out. So it's just funny how for Elijah, it was more to that kind of whispering sound, that breathing that God is. And it's not necessarily a title or a specific name. It's that breath of life.
Yeah.
That kind of what you're saying. So, it's like, oh, we try to think, oh, God's in the burning bush, in the fire, it's in a storm, it's in the clouds, but it's kind of like deeper than that. It's not an object. It's a life experience. It's a life living.
Yes, it's so much. It's not just a mystery, it's ungraspable. So all those magnificently powerful theophanies, and then it collapses to, you're just not going to get it because it's as big as life and it's as simple as life. I remember reading once, we come into the world on a breath and we leave on a breath. So it's so appropriate that you start out with these bombastic things and then it's life. It's in and out. And the scope of that is beyond us. And we have to be okay with that.
If that was paralleled in the gospel reading, after the storm died and everything just silenced with Jesus entering, all that's left for us, like the disciples, was pay Jesus homage, say, truly, you are the Son of God.
Oh, that's so good because it's so important. All that's left to us is worship. Once we start to realize this, the proper response is awe and worship and giving homage to God. It is truly our holy work.